First is words of attack or words of ridicule. Second is the threat of attack. And third is discouragement. And that's where we're going to camp out this morning. Because I don't know where you are today, but if you're like most of us, I would say you're discouraged. Nehemiah gives us some advice for overcoming distractions, because distractions are one of the 4 weapons that the enemy uses, our critics use, and I believe Satan even uses, but in particular here, these 2 guys, Sanballat and Tobiah, used to oppose him in rebuilding the walls. And last week we looked at a couple of weapons that our critics use to hammer us down, to pound us down with that mallet so that every time we try to move forward, we get hammered. And we looked at the first one and we discovered that the first weapon that our enemies, our critics use, are words of ridicule. But there was a second thing. You would think that actually Nehemiah's overcoming their words of ridicule would cause Nehemiah's opponents, his critics, to want to join him in the journey. But that's not what happens. Instead, we found out that initial success doesn't silence opposition, it intensifies it. So they move from words of ridicule to the threat of direct attack. But now while Nehemiah overcame the words of ridicule of his critics and the threat of direct attack of his critics as well, it had an effect on others. It was discouraging those who were around him, the workers. In fact, they became so discouraged, which in turn caused Nehemiah to be discouraged, which is the third weapon of our opponents, a third weapon of opposition. If you're like most of us, I would say you're discouraged. There's some element, there's something that's got you discouraged. Maybe it's the fact that Christmas isn't going to be Christmas. Maybe it's the fact that Thanksgiving wasn't Thanksgiving. Or maybe it's the fact that even in the midst of other hopeful things, there's still an uncertainty in your heart. And so there's this discouragement. And we find here that in particular, this discouragement didn't come from without. It didn't come from his enemies. It came from within. It came from within him, and I think more importantly, it came from within his family, within his circle of friends, within his co-workers. So maybe today you're discouraged, if not for yourself, you're discouraged because you see people around you who are discouraged. Sometimes, and maybe the greatest opposition comes from within, from our co-workers, from our family, from within ourselves, and from the people who should be our biggest cheerleaders. So what's Nehemiah do to encourage them? And in turn, encourage himself to continue to move forward. Well, notice he does 3 things. He told them to stop thinking about themselves and start thinking about others. There's a second thing he did, a second thing we need to do. Second, he encouraged them to remember and worship the Lord, who is great and awesome. But there's a third, and maybe it's the most important. He told them not to try to do it alone. Everyone should have someone they can call on when they're in trouble, when they're feeling fatigued, when they're feeling frustrated, when they're feeling like a failure, all the things that Judah was feeling like that. So let me say it again. Everyone should have someone they can call on. So Nehemiah, like a good coach, gave Judah 3 things to help them overcome the discouragement. First, to stop thinking about themselves and start thinking of others. And second, to remember and worship the Lord, who's great and awesome. And third, to remember that you don't have to go it alone.